What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Fantasy Football Over Analysis. Today we're talking about the Dallas Cowboys, their fantasy relevant players, and whether or not we are targeting or fading them in our drafts this summer. At quarterback, Dak Prescott last year turned in a QB6 finish, throwing for over 4,500 yards and 30 touchdowns. And that kind of season is just kind of the standard of what you expect from Prescott at this point. You always expect Dak to be among the league leaders in passing. You expect him to be over the 4,000 yard mark. You expect him to be throwing over 30 touchdowns. You do not, however, with Prescott, expect him to do a lot on the ground. Dak has been under 200 rushing yards in all but one of the last 6 seasons. And the other thing with Prescott that has been kind of a strange trend with him is that he's been injury prone every other year. In 2019, Prescott finishes as the QB2 overall. The next season, he only plays in 5 games and finishes as the quarterback 32. 2021, Prescott finishes as the QB8. 2022, he gets hurt, plays in only 12 games, and finishes as the QB18. 2023, Prescott comes back, he's healthy, he finishes as the QB3. 2024, Prescott gets hurt, he finishes as the QB31. And then last year, 2025, Prescott comes back healthy and turns into QB6 performance. So if we're following that trend, then that would suggest that Prescott is due for a down year this year. Of course, we can't live in a world where we predict injuries, so Dak coming in as the QB9 right now, he's going to be perfectly fine. He still has high-end weapons to throw to, and CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, Jake Ferguson as well. I myself don't get a lot of Dak. You still have to draft him as a QB1, and there's less room for things to go wrong for him since he doesn't have a lot of upside with his legs. So, especially given that I tend toward waiting a little later for quarterbacks as it is, I'd much rather be waiting for the Jared Goff, Brock Purdy tier than spending an earlier pick on Prescott. With Goff, Purdy, and the other late round quarterbacks, they all come with much similar floors than Prescott at a much cheaper cost, and similar ceilings as well. At running back, Javonte Williams, in his first year with the Dallas Cowboys, was one of the more pleasant surprises in fantasy football. Williams finishing as the RB12 in his first year with his new team. With Williams, however, a lot of his production did come in the first half of the year. From week 9 and on, there was definitely a fall off for him. Javonte, in his final 7 regular season games of the season, had only 3 games above 15 fantasy points. Javonte also scored 9 touchdowns in those first 8 weeks. In the final 7, he only scores 4. Javonte's receiving usage also suffered as well as the year went on. He caught 22 passes in the first 6 weeks, and then just 13 the rest of the season. So while the Cowboys didn't really bring in any competition for Williams this offseason, you have to wonder about what his ceiling really is at this point. And while you like that Williams is obviously still tied to a high-powered offense, I can't help but feel that he profiles a lot closer to a dead zone running back than the mid-tier RB2 that he's being drafted as right now, currently as the RB17. And really, it's all in those second half numbers for Williams. If the passing work isn't going to be there, then you need him to run hot with touchdowns, and if the touchdowns dry up, then at that point, all you have is the rushing volume on your side. And at that point, if all you've got is volume on your side, then Williams is actually a lot closer to Tony Pollard in Tennessee than a lot of people would like to admit. And just to illustrate the point, let's look at both Pollard and Javonte Williams from week 9 on last season. In that stretch, Pollard caught 14 passes, Williams caught 11. Pollard scored 3 touchdowns, Williams scored 4. From week 9 on, Tony Pollard had exactly 500 rushing yards, Javonte Williams had 586. During that same stretch, Tony Pollard had 300-yard rushing games, Javonte Williams had none. So the stats for those two during that stretch were really very similar. And keep in mind, Pollard plays in a much worse offense, whereas Williams plays in the high-powered one where he should theoretically have the opportunity to do a lot more. So at cost, I'm not interested in Javonte Williams. I think he's going to be one of the more overdrafted players in fantasy this year, and that's a headache that I'm happy to pass along to my league mates. And then at wide receiver, you have CeeDee Lamb coming off of back-to-back down years. Lamb last season finishing as the wide receiver 22. And Lamb last season gets hurt. He only plays in 14 games. He finishes under 80 receptions, under 100 receptions for the first time since 2021. He just barely gets over the 1,000-yard mark, and he only scores 3 touchdowns. And with Lamb, we did still see flashes of what he's been in the past. He did have 6 games with over 100 yards receiving. He did regularly receive double-digit targets. So the usage is still there for Lamb. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like CeeDee Lamb quite has the ceiling that he did a couple of years ago. And some of that has to do with George Pickens being there now. But the problem with Lamb is that his cost in drafts has not gone down at all. He's still coming in as the wide receiver 5. You're spending a first-round pick if you want him on your roster. And it's just been a couple of years at this point since we've seen Lamb be that guy that has the wide receiver 1 overall ceiling in his range of outcomes. I would have a lot more interest if he were going in the second round, but at cost, I would fade Lamb. I'd rather have Justin Jefferson. I'd rather have Drake London. I'd even rather wait and start with a running back and then go A.J. Brown in round 2 than I would spend a first-round pick on CeeDee Lamb at this point. And then you have George Pickens. Pickens, who had been a talented but frustrating guy to own when he was a member of the Pittsburgh Steelers, finally broke out with his first season in Dallas. Pickens finishes as the wide receiver 5, going for over 1,400 yards and 9 touchdowns. And what made Pickens so appealing last year was his cost in drafts. You could get him in the 4th, 5th, sometimes the 6th round, and at that point he was such a value. This year, the discount's gone. You now have to pay up for George Pickens. He's coming in at the wide receiver 10, going in the 2nd round in most drafts. And for me, that's going to be way too expensive of a price point for Pickens. And one of the things that the fantasy community tends to do over the years is overprice some of the wide receiver 2s on these explosive offenses. Think back to recent years where you've had to pay a mid to late 2nd round pick to get a guy like T. Higgins next to Jamar Chase, or Jalen Waddle next to Tyreek Hill, or Devontae Smith next to A.J. Brown. And when those guys are priced in that range, it's very hard for them to return value. And the wide receiver 2 spot on any team just tends to be so much more volatile by nature. And while you might have a guy like Pickens in that role where he might have higher than a typical wide receiver 2's talent, when he's got to compete with another alpha like CeeDee Lamb, then sometimes it's harder for him to hit his best case outcome, which you're now paying for. So at cost, Pickens is going to be a fade for me. I'll let my league mates chase what he did last season. And then at tight end, Jake Ferguson has always been a solid option at the position. Last year he finishes as the tight end 5. And Ferguson really did most of his damage early in the year when CeeDee Lamb was hurt. Down the stretch when everyone was healthy from week 9 and on, Ferguson only had 3 games above 10 fantasy points, and none of Ferguson's games went above 12. So really, for Ferguson to have a weekly ceiling, he needs either Pickens or Lamb to be out of the picture so he can function as the team's number 2 option. He's certainly streamable on any given week, but if everyone's healthy, then he profiles as a back-end tight end 1. And that's going to do it for this one, guys. So with the Cowboys, while this is a good, exciting offense, it's not a team that I get a lot of exposure to in fantasy, and it all comes back to the cost of all these players. CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens are way too expensive for me at the top of drafts. Dak you have to take as the QB9. I'd rather be waiting into the QB12 and beyond range rather than pay a premium for Prescott. Javonte Williams I think goes way too high as the RB17. And Jake Ferguson is someone that has really limited appeal as a back-end tight end 1. But I thank you guys so much for watching, and we will talk to you next time when we go over the Washington Commanders.